Thank you very much for having me. Yes, throughout my whole 10 years at UConn, it was never entirely clear how we were supposed to be pronouncing it. But yes, we did tend to go for UConn rather than UK OLN. But I'm here today to talk to you about the work that we've been doing within the Research Data Alliance to improve metadata interoperability. There are many groups in the Research Data Alliance who are interested in metadata in one way or another. So I thought I would start this presentation by just having a quick look at what we understand about metadata in what you would call the core metadata groups. The term literally means data about data. So if you're understanding data as being facts about things, then you would understand metadata to be facts about things. But that's not a terribly helpful definition, and it's probably too narrow an understanding of what we're really trying to get at with metadata. Perhaps a more helpful definition is to think of it as information, and in particular structured information, that helps us to work with other information. So the point is that people recognize metadata not by what they are, because anything could be metadata in the same way that anything could be data or anything could be evidence to support an argument. We recognize metadata by what they do, by the role that they play in a particular process. And indeed, we have names for different sets of metadata depending upon what they're useful for, the role that they play within the process. So within the research context, we're mostly concerned with these three broad areas of metadata. So discovery metadata, they're the pieces of information that help other researchers to find the data and to there are a superset of the information that they would need to reference it later on. We have contextual metadata, which is the information that institutions and funders like to use in order to keep track of the data that they're interested in order to monitor compliance and things like that. And it's also useful for conveying quality and relevance. And lastly, we have the structural and semantic metadata. By the structural metadata, we mean the information that you need in order to render this string of ones and zeros into a file that you can interact with using software, for example. And semantic metadata is the information that helps you to understand that rendered information and to be able to use and reuse that in your work. Now, simply documenting that information is a really good start, but it's even better to provide it in a structured form according to an agreed standard. And the reason for that is fundamentally about interoperability, about being able to use the same information in many different systems. But that's really something that only those of us on the infrastructure side of things really care about. What researchers want to know is what the interoperation of metadata-powered systems can do for them. If lots of data sets are using a common metadata standard, then you can build catalogues that search across that information in many different useful ways. And if you have several catalogues that are all using a common standard, you can then build aggregators that mean you can run the same search across all of them at once. If lots of different entities are documented in a reliable way, you can build systems for traversing the relationships between them. So that means you can enter into the network and get the information that you need through one interface instead of having to look things up in lots of different places, in lots of different ways, over and over again. And the more entities that are documented in a common way, the more comprehensive a network you can provide. If a data set is documented in a reliable way, it saves the next person a lot of time and effort coming to understand the data, meaning they can verify and build on and integrate the data with other data without having to do a lot of detective work first. And quite apart from the system's interoperability angle, there are a number of side benefits that come from people concentrating on a single standard for a single purpose. If people have a standard to work from, then they don't have to work everything out from scratch each time, which means they're less likely to miss out useful information. And after using the same standard a number of times, by becoming more familiar with it through practice, they get better and quicker at it. When many people are using the same standards, they can help each other when they get stuck by answering questions and sharing notes. And over time, this coalesces into better documentation. The common problems are then easier to identify, and if a lot of people care about it, it's easier to get the effort together to fix it. And when you have a critical mass of people who would benefit from it, you begin to see tools emerge that take away some of the pain of creating the metadata, and so on and so forth. So, if using standards is so beneficial, why isn't everyone using them? And it's true that not everyone is using them. I might not use a standard because I don't know of any that are suitable for my field of research. So this here is a graph taken from a study that was published in 2011, and that showed that out of a sample of 1,200 scientists, over 78% of the respondents used either no metadata at all or some homegrown metadata solution. The authors of the study blamed this on a lack of training. Researchers either didn't know or didn't care about metadata standards, which points to a need for a resource to make it easier to discover relevant standards. Another possibility is that there are just too many standards to choose from. Admittedly, that's quite a rarer situation, but where you do have duplication of standards, it gives rise to a massive duplication of effort and a dilution of the effort that's available to go into things like tools and documentation and training and even the future development of the standards themselves. We can blame some of this on divided communities and inflexible specifications, but I think some of this duplication is again down to ignorance of standards that are already out there being used, and ignorance of the profiling techniques that exist for adapting common standards for local needs. And one other reason that I can think of is that it's not always as simple as just telling somebody that to use a particular standard. If you just give somebody an XML specification and tell them to get on with it, filling it out, the chances are they're not going to take your request very kindly. At the very least, you want to be able to give them a stack of examples that they can look at and adapt for their own circumstances. But ideally, you want to hide all of this complexity away from them entirely and give them instead a simple web form, ideally one which is plugged into several other systems so that it means half of the fields are already filled in with the right values for them. Even better, to give them a phone number of someone they can call if they get stuck. The point is that it's not just the standards themselves that are important, but also the ecosystem that's grown up around them. So for that reason, I can't just tell the researchers that I support just use standards. It's a struggle sometimes just to find the right standard for them to use, and let alone work out how they're meant to be using it. So for this reason, a group of metadata enthusiasts went to the newly formed Research Data Alliance in 2013 and asked to set up a metadata standards directory working group. After some negotiation to get the terms of reference right, the group was set up and it started work in August of that year. And their goals were to, first and foremost, develop a Research Data Alliance metadata standards directory that would list standards relevant for research data. And the goals for this directory were that it should be comprehensive across disciplines, comprehensive across countries, comprehensive across use cases, and that it should also be easy for anybody to contribute to or update in order to spread the load of being able to keep it current and up to date. The second thing this group wanted to do was to define and develop use cases for research metadata, primarily to help organize the records in the most natural way and try and make the directory as useful as it could possibly be for the community. And lastly, they wanted to develop a plan for the long-term growth and maintenance of the directory to make sure that it was a sustainable resource for the community to use. Now, the idea of using catalogues like this and setting up discovery services for metadata standards wasn't new, and there are many other resources out there that enumerate metadata standards. At the time this group was being set up, most of them were either one-off reports or discipline-specific maintained lists. And in fact, there was at that time only one other resource that was both generic and dynamic, and that was the Digital Curation Centre's Disciplinary Metadata Catalogue, and that happened to be one that I was responsible for maintaining. So we joined forces, and I joined the RDA group, and together we formulated a plan of how to take this work forward. The issue with the Digital Curation Centre's directory was that it was just another section of their website, so for security reasons only DCC staff could edit it. So if anybody spotted an error or wanted to add anything, then they had to go through the DCC help desk, and things would not necessarily happen immediately, and I imagine for somebody trying to contribute information into it, at times it could perhaps seem like the contributions were going into a black hole. Plus the information was sort of trapped on the web pages and not very reusable. So we try to improve both of those things. So in stage 1 of the Metadata Standards Directory group's work, we conducted a worldwide survey to update and extend the content of the DCC directory. And then in the second stage, we set up a new version of the directory on GitHub. It could do nearly everything that the original directory could do, although I'll admit it isn't quite as pretty. And one of the good things about it, though, was that the underlying data was then made available easily on the internet in a format called YAML, which is a computer readable format that's also human readable, so that it makes it easy for anybody to inspect it, use it, or incorporate it into new systems. The process for submitting information was opened up to public view, and if there were any queries about the information that was being provided, we could hold a debate about it in the open, so that it increased the transparency of the process of keeping it up to date and current. But as I say, while all of this was going on, we were also gathering ideas about what people might want to use the directory for. We asked them to be imaginative and creative and really just give us a wish list of things that they might want to use the directory for. And they did. They came up with lots of great ideas. Unfortunately, for most of them, we couldn't actually support that through the way that we'd set the directory up. the directory is really a statically generated HTML site. It's not dynamic at all, so there's a limit to how much we were able to do with it. But among the ideas that were put forward were the ability to be able to search through the records instead of just browsing through them, to be able to access the data with machine-to-machine protocols to make it easier to incorporate the information into other systems. There are also calls for the directory to hold richer information about standards such as their version history, some more detailed information about mappings that existed between standards, and where endorsements or other recommendations exist for which standards to use for which purposes. And a number of the use cases that were put forward to us relied on greater use of entity relationships, so that it would be easier, for example, to find out which standards had been funded by which funding body. So among the kinds of services that were suggested were the ability to discover which metadata standards held sets of information that a particular user would be interested in using, and how they would go about extracting that information from compliant metadata records. Being able to discover where mappings exist between different metadata standards and finding ways of migrating metadata from one standard to another. And where those pathways don't exist, the facility to be able to compare standards side by side and see which elements are in common between the two, as being a basis for generating a rough and ready converter for migrating between those pathways, or at least to see the feasibility of creating one. So over the last year and a half we've been working on a new metadata standards catalogue in our new metadata standards catalogue working group. This catalogue can do everything that the old directory did, plus a whole lot more. Now, at this stage I had hoped to be able to show you a live demonstration of it on the web. Unfortunately, there have been some delays in setting up the server to accommodate it, but we are hoping to launch it in the next few weeks. But in the meantime, I can give you an idea of what it looks like. So this is an example of a page that shows a metadata standard. And everything on this page is meant to help in answer an important question. So at the top of the record, we've got the name and the description, followed by the research areas that it's mainly used for. There's some facilities for showing the types of data it's useful for documenting as well. And we have a section for responsible organizations, maintainers and funders. And later on in the record there's a space for recommendations and endorsements, and these are all helping to answer that question: is this the right metadata standard for me to be using for my research data? In order to answer the question of how I'm going to use it, we also provide in there links to specifications and user guides. We provide any identifiers that have been associated with that metadata standard to help people refer to it or find it again. There's some more information about the version history, about schemes that are based on the current one, or if the standard in question is a profile of which other standard it is a profile. And these help put the standard in context, gives people an idea of how mature it is, how well supported it's likely to be, how much attention is being paid to it. And to help answer the question of interoperability, the ability to move metadata in and out of the standard, we also provide information on all the mappings that we know of that are available to work with it. And lastly, there's some more information to help people use the standard. So we've got a list of ready-made tools that are available to help people either process metadata according to this standard or to create it from scratch for themselves. and we provide examples of people who are or services that are already using the standard, so people can go and see how it's being used there, and that will help to give them a clue as to how they might be able to implement it locally. We also have a facility for showing some sample records so that people can use that as a basis for creating their own records according to that standard. We also provide a search facility where you can search by title, subject, identifier, data type or funder, and we've got an API that's available for getting the same information out in JSON format. One of the biggest changes is a web form interface for editing the records, which you can access by signing in through Google, Twitter or various other providers. And one of the most recent developments is also an API that you can use for editing the records, for which you'll need to register your application with the catalogue. Even so, there are still more features that we haven't managed to build into the current generation of the catalogue yet, but we've set things up in such a way that hopefully we'll be able to add them in at a later date. So here are some examples of the things left on my request tracker to try and implement, such as highlighting if the organization responsible for a standard is a recognized standards body, the ability to be able to dynamically filter the list of standards so that while you're browsing it's easier to get to the standard that you want quicker. That facility I mentioned for doing side-by-side comparisons between different specifications, some alternative views for the version history and so on. So if you want to follow what we're doing with the metadata standards catalog, I've provided the URL at the bottom of that slide, and you can follow that for more information and to track our progress as we maintain the catalogue going forward. I think this and the changes being made to some of our peer catalogues like Fair Sharing have the potential to make a serious improvement in the standard of data documentation with knock-on benefits for discovery, reuse and sharing, as I outlined at the beginning. Now, some of the things on this slide are dependent upon other work that's going on in other groups, and one of those is the work being conducted by the metadata interest group. Now, what they're trying to do is rather controversially, perhaps, define some canonical metadata packages for different use cases. Now, the idea is that we're thinking about which are the most useful metadata elements for particular purposes. And we're trying to identify where these occur in various metadata standards. The idea being is that then when you need to, you'll be able to grab the metadata you need from any given standard and then encode it again in any other standard to support others with the same use case. And this will also help to make it easier to maintain mappings between the standards, since you will only need n mappings, where n is the number of standards, instead of n squared. So on the slide there are all the high-level elements that we identified from the use cases that were collected by the core metadata groups within the RDA. But as you can see, they are at a fairly high level of abstraction. So we've been working on unpacking these elements into more precise concepts. So just to give you a quick example with the spatial coordinates, if you want to identify a spatial point, then probably what you're going to need is an X and a Y and a Z in a particular declared coordinate system. There may be some connections with a temporal coordinate, because if you're looking at a stellar event that happened 1,000 light years away, then you'll also be looking at it when it happened 1,000 years ago. So there might be some interconnection there. But as well as actually defining the points, then you might be interested in its precision, its accuracy and its resolution. And once you've got an idea of a spatial point, then you can then look at more complicated ways of expressing positions, such as polygons and rectangles and things like that. So if you'd like to join in with this activity, then please do follow the link to the Metadata Interest Group web page, and follow the links from there to the set of Google Docs that we've set up for you to be able to add your thoughts. And once we're reasonably confident about these elements, then we plan to publish them as an official RDA output. So just to bring my talk to a close, I just wanted to pull out a few thoughts about use of metadata in the research context. And these points will be relevant to you if you're a researcher, if you're a data manager, or even if you're setting up a data archive in your own institution. Documentation is something that is just generally a good thing to have. Even if people have provided bad documentation, it's much better than providing no documentation at all. But documentation can be made more useful and more valuable by providing more structure to it. Now, one easy way of doing that is, if you've got it in simply a human readable format, is to introduce headings and sections to provide that structure. But the key point is always to try and be consistent with it. So the more consistency that you have, the more you're able to process it in a more automated fashion. And the actual ideal is to use a metadata standard. And the places to look for that are things like the metadata standards directory or catalogue, and there are other more specific directories available as well. If you find a metadata standard that looks about right, but it's not an exact fit for your use case, the way forward is ideally to create your own local profile of a general standard. This way that you'll be able to serve your own use cases while still maintaining interoperability with other systems. If you go your own way and have a completely bespoke scheme, then that metadata is siloed within your own organizational system. And that makes moving stuff around a lot harder. But the most important thing, as I said before, is to try and be consistent. If there's a consistent error, we can correct for it, we can make allowances. But if each record is a muddle in a different way and it has to be sorted out by hand, it kind of defeats